Hi, welcome back, and this is part 3. So in the previous parts we looked at the basics of UV mapping, sort of what it means to UV map an object. In the second part we looked at an example of UV mapping a fairly simple object, and we didn't really look at why you'd want to UV map it in that way. But in this part we're actually going to not create this exact scene, but we're going to go over some of the techniques that I used to create this. So this was directly inspired by one of my viewers. He asked me a question about UV mapping text, and he showed me a few reference images from another 3D artist. And one of the images had some really three-dimensional looking cheese. And I thought it might be a fun exercise to try to recreate that, but using UV mapping as sort of a core technique. So this is the image I came up with at the end. And one of the areas that UV mapping helped me in is where these indentations in this sort of ugly looking faux Swiss cheese, where these indentations are on the edge of a letter, it looks really cool because you can actually see the three-dimensional effect of it, not just on the face of the text, but on the edge of the text here where it sort of eats away at it. And I think that UV mapping was really critical to selling this effect using displacement, which is the main technique that I used. You can see here the texture tag has a really intense displacement channel. I used this cheese texture that I found online, and then I painted some displacement for it. And this is what I came up with. So I'm going to show you guys how to create some text and UV map it so that it plays nicely with a displacement technique such as this one. Here in the scene file, you can actually see where the magic happens, which is that from the front face of the text, the texture wraps extremely smoothly around the edges. It's not as graceful on the inside parts of the letters, and we'll see why, but on all of the outside faces of the letters, you have this really graceful blending and wrapping of the texture as it goes from the front of the text over to the side. Now, we learned in our previous videos that even though UV mapping allows you to remove seams from certain areas like this, it really only lets you shuffle the seams around. You have to have a seam somewhere, and in this example, the seam is actually on the back of the object. We have these bevels on the front and rear of the object, and the bevel comes around the rear, and then boom, it hits this seam, and you see that it's visible. But in this case, we're not looking at the back of this object, so it doesn't matter. And that's really what I meant by saying that you can hide the seams. Okay, so let's move to a new project, and I'm going to move kind of quickly because this is the third part. Let's start with some mograph text. Always takes a while for the fonts to load. And let's center the text. And let's use a font such as, let's see, I got a interesting font from Google Fonts. I don't remember what it's called. Let's try this. I think this is it. So this is the font that I was using, and for our example, let's use the word cheese. And so we have these letters now, and they're a mograph text object, which is a nice, quick and easy way to create some text. So I don't want to make the letters too thick, but I do want to apply some caps, a fillet cap or fillet cap. I've seen it pronounced both ways. Let's constrain so that it doesn't make the letters too fat. And let's sort of reduce how intense that is and give it 3 segments. So we're sort of just rounding off the front of the text, and actually it's actually giving us something to obsess over, which is really what the screencast is about. So borrowing one of Grayscale Gorilla's tips, the next step is actually going to be to put this into a connect object. So if I'm just going to look at the wireframe really quickly, we have a lot of detail here. I'm actually going to remove some of that before I go to the connect object. So I'm going to use subdivided spline, and let's use a really large angle like 35. And on the caps, let's actually use a quadrangles with a regular grid instead of n-gons, and a regular grid of about, well, let's do it from over here. So let's do 2.756, and let's copy that value over to the regular grid. I have a couple of screencasts that actually talk about this exact topic, if you are interested. So now we have a lot more geometry to work with, but in general it just helps us make cleaner objects to work with. So now we have this text, and we are going to use one of the Grayscale Gorilla's techniques, which is to use the connect object to make this transition here smooth. It's also going to give us another benefit, which is that it is going to make all of this one object. If I were to just say current state to object right now, I get a series of objects. For each letter, I get rounding and caps. That's not really what we want, because that means we're going to have to reconstruct the object. We're going to have to connect all of this geometry before UV mapping it, because otherwise it would be trivial to UV map this, because they're all sort of separated into real world shells already. But that's not what we want. So we can just create a connect object, and we put our motext inside of it, and you can see right here that it now has a smooth Phong transition along that rounded edge. And we can also tweak the threshold, the tolerance, to sort of destroy the text. It's not what we want to do. We can get rid of some of these artifacts by just increasing the tolerance a little bit. And as long as nothing looks broken or messed up, let's start with that. Cheese might be too long of a word for this example. Let's do yum. Or let's change the case. Okay, so this is going to be a little more manageable, so we don't have as many objects to work with. So what I'm going to do next is just right click and say current state to object, and we get a single object that is a single continuous piece of geometry. So what I typically do is just turn off the objects that I'm done with and hide them. That way I can regenerate this object at a later point if I want to. Now we notice that this already has a UV map. I'm going to bring in those two texture tags I had in the last project, and we'll see what the default UV map looks like. Okay, so I just brought those textures in, and if we apply the stones texture, you can immediately see that we have a bit of a problem. It looks like the only part of this object that's actually UV mapped is the hull, the sides of the text, and the front face of the text is not UV mapped, nor is the back face. Funnily enough, the rounding is UV mapped. But either way, the only way we can actually make use of this is if we tile this many times. And let's see, I'm up to 13, 16 tiles on the U dimension, and we can see it's sort of starting to look useful, but it's not even the same space for the rounding and the hull. So in general, this isn't going to work for us, what we have here. So I'm just going to delete the UV tag because it's no good to us. Now what we want to do, I'm also going to tweak the Phong tag. Sometimes you get the Phong breaks. So I'm just going to uncheck use edge breaks, and I'm going to uncheck angle limit so that we force all surfaces to be smooth, even ones that maybe shouldn't, like the center of the Y. I'm still going to force it. So now we have this sort of yum text, and you know, if you're a stickler for kerning, that was probably hurting your eyes for the last few minutes, but we can fix that. Nobody likes bad kerning. So now we have a much more organized piece of geometry. It's much more conducive to being mapped. And what we can do is figure out, okay, which parts are going to be, like, where's the seam going to be? And in our sample file that we saw a few minutes ago, we saw that we put the back side of the text as the part where we were going to have the seam. So the easiest way to get that is probably just to select it from the top view. So I'm going to select the text and go to polygon mode using a rectangular selection. Just going to select the polygons that belong on the back, but this time I'm going to uncheck only select visible elements so that we get all of the polygons in the back, just like that. That's perfect. And once we have these, we can set a selection, or we can do a variety of things. But what I'm going to do is apply my test pattern to this object with flat mapping. And it's okay that it's backwards, so I'm also going to increase the resolution on these so we can see them a little bit better. There we go. And so flat mapping is fine. I don't really care that it's backwards at this point. I am just going to assign the UV coordinates, and then I'm going to invert my selection. Oh, actually I don't have to. Because the object didn't have a UV tag, when we assigned UV coordinates to one part of the object, the other parts of the object got the same UV coordinates assigned. In this case, that actually works out pretty well. So I'm just going to go to the UV edit view so that I can now see what I'm dealing with. Now I have all the polygons except the back faces selected, so I am just going to go to my UV polygons mode and drag them away so that I can separate those into two shells. Now I'm going to put the back shell aside for a moment because I don't care about it as much as I care about the front shell. So I'm just going to put it off to the side, and then we're going to look at this yum word. I'm going to scale it down so it actually fits in our UV space, and we can already see that it's the correct orientation because we can read our numbers 1 2 3 1 2 3 5 6 7 8, and we see here that the front looks perfectly mapped. If you saw video number 2, you'll understand why this is important. And then we see the banding and the stretching going around to the back. That's okay. What we can do is just deselect some of the polygons on the front of the object. So using the live selection tool here and holding Control, I'm just going to deselect some of the polygons on the front. It doesn't need to be all, it can just be some that I know for a fact are properly mapped. And the reason we're doing this is because they will suffer distortion because of the unfolding of the rest of the object if we don't do this. So what we're doing is we're saying, Cinema 4D, you are not allowed to unwrap these polygons that we have just deselected. You are to leave them exactly as they are. So once we have that done, we can go to our Relax tab. We can check Pin to Neighbors. That way it's going to pin the selected polygons to the unselected ones, limiting how far they can go. And once we've done that, we can just hit Apply, and we get an error down here. Okay, so this is new. I've never gotten an error like this before, but I believe what the message was basically telling me is that we have some bad geometry right here. So we can fix this. We really do have some bad geometry here. So this is why it's important to have good geometry, because when you tell Cinema 4D to run its magical automatic unwrapping algorithm, if there's some geometry like this that just really doesn't make sense to it, it's gonna have a problem with it. So at this point we do have a bit of an issue because we need to delete some of these polygons that are getting in the way. And by deleting some of these polygons, we are sort of destroying part of our UV map. So we're going to have to map this again. But what I'm going to do is use the knife tool and uncheck visible only, uncheck restrict to selection. I'm just going to cut right through that region. It's going to create a few extra points for us, which I can then select, and using the weld tool, I can weld those points. So this geometry should be a little bit better now, but you see we have a problem. We've deleted a polygon in the process, which I've just replaced, but now that polygon has incorrect mapping. So here's how we fix that. We go back to our UV view and we select all the polygons. Once we have all the polygons selected, we can deselect the ones we know are the back face. And now we just have this left, which is this new triangle that I had to create along with everything else that was previously mapped. Well, we can just change this back to flat mapping, assign UV coordinates, and there we go. We're right back to where we were before we got that error message. Now let's do a quick test to make sure we won't get that message again with some other bad geometry before doing too much work. So what I'll do is I'll just deselect a few polygons from each of these letters, and then I'll run the command again. So this time it did it properly. It had a few issues and the result didn't look very good, but I didn't get an error. So what I'm going to do is continue deselecting some of these. And I'm warning you, the distortion we're about to see is going to be pretty severe. But depending on how you deal with it, it can be dealt with. So I'm just going to deselect these polygons, which should pin them in place. And then I'm going to hit the relax command, and what we see looks like chaos. Some of it is chaos, but for the most part, most of it is going to be okay. Stepping back a little bit, what has happened is the areas that we selected have stayed put. Everything that was connected to it has been spread out. So we have the letter Y, the letter U, and then the letter M. Now I mentioned we might get some overlapping bits in the centers of the letters, and that's what you're seeing right here. In general, this is a really bad thing, especially for characters or if you're doing ambient occlusion. But in this case, it's not going to be a really huge deal because of the way that we're applying this. And now we have the back faces, and we can do the same thing to them. But I warn you, they're currently backwards, which means that if we try to unwrap it by pinning some of the points, it's actually going to fail a little bit. So before we try to unwrap it, let's just select these, and over here in UV commands, we can actually mirror U, and it flips it around so it's backwards here in our view, but that means that it's forward here in the viewport. So once we have that, we can then choose our live selection tool again, just deselect some of the letters, well, some of the internal parts of the letters that we know are properly mapped. And once we've done that, we can go back to relax, and we can just relax those, and it barely budged because they were already pretty well mapped. And now we have this. We have 6 shells that are all flattened out, and we're ready to apply cool textures to it. So what we can do is go to the optimal mapping tab, just like we did in the second video, and we can realign them. In this case, I'm going to preserve orientation because I don't want Cinema 4D to rotate the letters around. I'm happy with the orientation that they're in right now. I would like it to equalize the island size, and a spacing of about 6% should be fine. So when I press apply, it's going to add all of these to this mapping area. Maybe I can reduce the spacing some more. And let's see what happens if I don't preserve orientation. Yeah, it starts to rotate things a bit. Now let's just leave it like that. It's going to be fine. So if we go back to our 3D view, we can see the fruits of our labor. So I'm going to go back to my standard view and deselect the object. And we can see right here that we're wrapping around the edge of the object, just like the cheese in the other example was. And that means that now we can actually apply that cheese texture, and it should wrap smoothly around the edges of the text. Now remember the M, the inside parts were overlapping. This is what I meant by it wasn't a huge deal. We're getting a number 2 right here. We're getting the same number 2 on the inside of this part. That's because these two bits are overlapping in the UV view. But you can see here that just because we have a number 1 on this part of the M and on this part of the M, and a number 2 here and a number 2 there, it's not a big deal because we're mapping a repeating texture. If we were mapping a hand-painted texture, what it would mean is that the exact same thing you painted here is going to appear on the other inside part of the M. And if you're not okay with that, you're going to need to find some way to reduce that distortion. But in our case, it doesn't really matter. So now we can take our cheese texture and apply it to the words. Now, it definitely needs to be tiled because it's not a very large texture. So I'm going to tile it 5 times on U and V. And here we go. We have this cheese texture that is repeating and smoothly wrapping around the edges of the text. You can see it on the M a lot. Let me reduce it to 3 tiles. See if we can see it a little bit better. Yeah, you're seeing a little bit more of it on the U now. And on the top of the M a little bit near the center. Let's interactively adjust the amount of tiles until we like what we see. I think something like that looks really nice. So we have this texture, and what I'm going to do now is I'm going to load a displacement map. So this was a displacement map that I hand painted. I just took the cheese texture, turned it to grayscale, and then made all of the holes a little bit deeper by just using the paintbrush and painting into it a little bit. So if we were to render this now, it looks pretty horrible because we just don't have enough polygons to support this. But if we were to place this in a HyperNURBS object, we can get some extra polygons for free. And we want to make sure the HyperNURBS is using a boundary or edge method to subdivide the UVs, otherwise strange things happen. So I'm going to look at the wireframe view, and it looks like that should be enough polygons to deal with for now. We can also look at the different UV subdivision methods if you have n-gons to deal with. So now we can do a render again, and we see we're getting this sort of indented look. So the displacement is a little too extreme right now, so I'm going to reduce it to 0.8. And we can redo that render, and we see that we're kind of getting that effect that I got. Now, the effect that I was getting had a few other channels turned on. For instance, in the diffusion channel, I put the ambient occlusion effect so that wherever we got an indentation, it actually shaded it a little bit darker. It's a little difficult to see in this scene, but it actually is a bit darker. And if you wanted to see less of the color texture and more of the actual displacement, what you can do is manually select sort of a yellow color for the cheese, and then you can use the mix slider to reduce the amount of cheese texture and increase the amount of pure yellow. And what that'll do is make it look like more of a uniform yellow with just the dimples. So we can see how our UV map is affecting these dimples. And you can see here where it wraps around, we're actually getting it to sink in a way that probably wouldn't look as good if we used cubic mapping or spatial mapping or cylindrical mapping. And it looks like we have a polygon error up there. That's okay, it's probably from the HyperNURBS. So if we turn the, yep. So it's just one of the things where you need to look for errors like this before you UV map. But I was careless in this case because I'm more concerned about how much time this is taking. So as we saw in our other videos, you can also control where the seams are. We're not seeing any seams right here on these letters. But if we go around to the back and look carefully, we can see where the seam is. So this is pretty much the end of this little series where I wanted to introduce you to UV mapping, show you a few techniques and how you would break a mesh up to UV map different parts of it, and then show you sort of a practical application of how you can use this to your advantage. I would love some feedback on this. Every time I do one of these videos about UV mapping or another topic, I get a bunch of great feedback with advice, tips and tricks. Some of you guys saying, hey, you're doing that the hard way. There's a command that just does that for you. And it's been really great to get the feedback from you guys. So if you like this, if you want to see more stuff like this, if I was rambling about something a little bit too much, let me know. This is all the good kind of feedback that I'm looking for. I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you got something useful from it. And until next time, see ya.